Welcome to the Success Talk Show, the podcast for ambitious leaders who want to get their best results and create a workplace for their teams to thrive. Each week, we share practical advice to help you accelerate your success and grow as an inspiring leader. Now, here's your host, Leadership Success Coach, Donna Ceriani.
Welcome to another episode of the Success Talk Show. This is Donna Ceriani, and I'm thrilled to have as my special guest today, Frederik Rasmussen, CEO of innRoad, a cloud-based hotel management solution for independent hotels. And at innRoad, Frederick is focused on becoming number one in the industry while growing a company that values diversity and is a great place to work. So welcome, Frederick.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
So Frederick, you've been successful. I mean, you and I have talked about this quite a bit. You've been really successful at bringing in top talent into innRoad to create a great place to work, and you're building a great company. But one of the challenges I see is that working in a startup environment, it has a unique set of challenges. So I'm curious, what advice do you have for someone who wants to work at a startup? So for example, are there specific skills or abilities or even personality that's unique to this type of environment?
I think probably sort of the core skills are probably more similar to other industries, but I think the mindset's probably different. Obviously, sort of startups and younger sort of aggressive growth companies, we tend to overwhelmingly focus on doing things that haven't been done before, or at least doing things that haven't been done before in that industry. And so we'll start with a certain path of how we're trying to get to do that, but we'll know we'll have to change. We don't have 15 years of history that sort of shows us what has worked and what doesn't. So we know right off the bat that we're going to change a lot. It's actually sort of our key advantage. It's that we have the ability to change more rapidly, whether or not that's our sales strategy or product direction. So getting people that can adapt, not only are they willing to, but they also are good at it and good at being able to reorient themselves. So, being fast learners, that's key. I think we have a good collection of really fast learners here that do that. I think you also have to be comfortable with working with some degree of things not working at the moment or not working perfectly. Most of the things we roll out are not perfect. If we were to wait for perfect, we probably wouldn't launch many of the initiatives or projects or whatever we learn. We sort of have to trust that we roll something out and then we learn. Again, we sort of adapt. Every startup would sort of agree that that's sort of the key lifeblood of any startup. So if you're thinking about getting into a startup, or something that looks like it, I think you have to be cognizant of that. And if you think you might get frustrated by that, well, this might not be the right place for you. On the other hand, you get really excited about the impact and contribution that might offer. Well, then I think in that sense, there's really something to offer in that type of environment.
I really love, your advice when you mentioned, you really need to be adaptable, and being adaptable is something that is actually an emotional intelligence skill, somebody who can be adaptable. So if somebody needs to follow, and there are certain, personality types where a person's strength can be they're good at consistency, focus, discipline, and they thrive when they do the same thing over and over again because they can sort of perfect it. And so if that's somebody's listening and that's their nature and they love that type of environment, that might not fit so well in a startup environment where you're launching quickly, you need to learn from mistakes, be comfortable doing it. So I think that's great advice, Frederick.
Yeah, that's been a key sort of determinant of who ends up really growing well with the company. I think the other thing that's sort of related is own the result rather than the task, and let that guide you, because we're operating in sort of uncertainty and in places where we don't have 15 years of track record. There's lots of times when people would encounter situations that they either haven't been specifically trained for or they're not sure how to approach. And what I see is that people have two different reactions to them. Certain people sort of stop dead in their tracks and say, this isn't exactly what I was trained for, or I'm not sure how to solve this. And other people sort of own the problem and they own the result and say, well, I might not know how, but there's probably not anybody else here, or there may not be anybody else here who's faced this before. So I'm as good of a resource as any to try to figure out how to solve this. And that gives the organization tremendous leverage. If we have 60 to 70 employees that are focused on that, that's so much more valuable than having, 10 to 15 people that can end up sort of giving directions to everyone else on how to solve things.
So somebody needs to be comfortable. They may be the person who's the pioneer, who's going into uncharted territory. There may not be someone else to turn to for guidance or support because they may be the ones who are developing that experience for the first time.
I think so. I think that's from, that goes for every single one of our employees. Whether or not it's a customer support person that's facing a query they haven't heard before, or an obstacle to a sale or a single piece of code. I mean, everyone faces something that their predecessor hasn't necessarily faced before, or their manager, indeed. And so it really is so much more helpful for us and critical to the own person's success if they can approach that and say, well, I believe and trust in my ability to try to sort of figure this out at first. And then, of course, always ask for help and everything else, but not just stopping dead in their tracks and having good ideas about how we improve is critical.
Yeah, and something that I'm really fascinated by too that you said, Frederick, was you said, people need to be comfortable, be able to learn fast, and be comfortable with things maybe not working perfectly the first time. And it kind of reminded me, I'm not sure if I'm going to get this right, but I think it was Peter Diamandis from the book Bold, and he was saying, I think it's him, if you launch and everything works perfectly, you probably waited too long to launch.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, that stuff is starting to seep into product in a lot of places. I think we try to embrace that, and I think many other companies like us do, try to embrace that in pretty much all aspects of our company. So whether or not it's a customer service initiative or whatever else it is, we'll try to get something out there as fast as possible and then very quickly learn from how do we do things better in that sort of particular initiative.
Yeah. And so when I think about, Frederick, your environment, and I know, as I mentioned earlier, one of your primary goals is to become, number one in your industry. So I'm curious, what strategies, from a leadership standpoint you could share on how can you inspire an organization to all pull in the same direction, really to share that vision and all work together to make that happen?
I think it's critical that you give people ownership of their task, but really make sure that they also understand the impact not only that they have, but the person next to you and the person, on the farthest reach of the office on the customer and on the business. The language where you get this to really work, I think, is talking in terms of the customers. We have a certain amount of customers, and if you can make those real to people and you can make the impact real, I think it goes a really long way to making sure that everyone is sort of focused on the right thing, which is impacting them as much as possible. In a smaller company, that's one of the luxuries. You really can't escape the customer. You're really close to the business. So if you make sure that you sort of reward and publish good performances and the effects on the customers across departments and making sure they're, then I think you develop this sort of shared understanding of what we're all trying to achieve, which is we're really trying to get to, affecting the customer as much as possible. And then I think, you really do get a shared understanding of where everyone is sort of going. I think that's probably the most aspiring and sort of unifying thing. And it also really helps, frankly, with like conflict resolution. Because if you've got different departments, if we can all agree and we all go into these sort of conversations with a shared understanding that, hey, here's what we're trying to do. Well, engineering can have one way of trying to get there and one set of priorities, and customer service can have another. But at least we're still starting with the same context. And we're just sort of like drawing, lines in the sand and staring across from each other.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm thinking about, Frederick, that I personally really enjoy is when you're working in a smaller company, especially where, a smaller software company, one of the key advantages you mentioned that I love is you can clearly see the impact that you're having on the customer and the contribution that you're making. When you work with say you're working at a company that's 50,000 employees, sometimes it's difficult to see what your impact really meant to the business, because oftentimes it's just too hard to figure out because you're just, a small piece of a big puzzle. And with a smaller company, everybody has a very clear line of sight to what they're doing for the customer, whether it's engineering, product, customer service, marketing, accounting. Everybody's like only one degree of separation from the customer. I mean, personally, that's probably one of the things I love about working with, in a smaller company setting. So what I'm wondering too is, Frederick, a lot of the coaching clients that I work with, they may be a senior leader. They may already be, in the executive ranks, but they may be aspiring to the C-suite or even becoming the CEO of their own company. And so I'm curious, what advice do you have for them on how to prepare themselves for, say, that bigger role?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing that helped me was just trying to understand how decisions are made in areas that are not your functional area, or in areas or in sort of above you, can be really helpful. Because eventually, if it all goes well and you meet your goal, then you end up owning those areas. And that could be a little new. And taking myself, for example, I don't have a coding background. I don't have a technical background that way. I have a very capable, technology team. But how do I give that team direction? And how do I make sure that team's performing as best possible? And I think if you try to understand how the decisions are being made in that department, and inherently what are the trade-offs that are part of that discussion, because I think all conversations come down to the same trade-offs. It's all about what are we optimizing for? Are we optimizing for quality, speed, cost, whatever it is? And if you can get to a point where you can understand some of the decisions that are being made in those other divisions and how they make them, well, then I think at the time when you get to own them, you have an ability to sort of speak the same language as those people and say, hey, how do we optimize for what our priority is, given our constraints, or given what we'd like to trade off? So I think that certainly helps. That's one thing I think certainly helps.
I think that is brilliant, really brilliant advice, because if I think about that fast path to CEO, well, I don't know about fast, but, somebody could have a finance background. Typically, I think I've seen, a lot of folks maybe from a sales organization, or it could be technology. But when you, like just what you said, Frederick, that somebody rose to that position, but they didn't grow up with all of those disciplines under their belt. So I love what you're saying. I think it's brilliant advice, because if somebody's listening and they're in engineering, well, the more they can learn about how finance decisions get made, the better it prepares them not only to be that senior executive. What I love about it is it actually helps them today, because maybe that leader needs to get more headcount. They need to ask for budget. They need to get budget for something. There's some trade-offs with decisions being made. And at the very least, they're getting insight onto how other organizations are going to work with them. So anyway, I think it's brilliant advice. And, kind of with that in mind, I know that so many times when I'm coaching a leader, especially, if they're an ambitious leader, they're looking for ways to either get in front of their CEO to, it might be they want to pitch an idea, or maybe they want to participate in the strategic conversation. So they'd love to have a seat at the table to contribute. So what advice, if someone's listening and that really resonates with them, what advice do you have for them to get the attention of their own CEO?
I mean, I don't think this is new, but I do still think it's surprising to me. Well, maybe it shouldn't be surprising. It's something that can certainly be done a lot more. And it really is, just bring not only the problem, but bring like a potential solution. Look like you're sort of trying to solve the problem, because, as a CEO, you own every problem at the same time. And if somebody brings to you another problem, I mean, that's information you want, but it goes on one list of 120. And your job is to try to get them off that list, right? So, somebody gets an incremental amount of my attention if they go, hey, we have a problem in sales or problem in engineering. Great. But if they then go, and by the way, I think I have a way we might be able to solve it, or I have a couple of thoughts or solutions as to how we solve it, and you really sort of nail the home run if you go, hey, and by the way, I have some rough thoughts on what it would cost or what it would mean for us to implement some of this stuff and when we could do it. I mean, now we're at action, and you'll probably not only walk into my office, but you'll probably walk out of my office at the same time with a decision on how we're doing it or a path forward on it. So, getting to that point, I think, too many times what I see is people focus on the problem, and they almost think that the problem is new to them, and so it must be new to the world. And oftentimes it's not. We probably are definitely looking for, ways in which we can solve the problem. And that certainly gets my attention, but it also shows me that the person is thinking about this in the right way. So, if there are other things, I would feel better about this person thinking about other things in the same way.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, because with the smaller, again, getting back to a startup environment, a smaller company, it seems like, most people in the company can say, I know my CEO, I've spoken with him many times, he knows my name, we know each other. And so I think sometimes in the bigger companies, it does get a lot more hierarchical. And so somebody trying to position themselves to get into the C-suite, talk to the CEO, it becomes a real challenge, right? Because there's so many levels, and it becomes very political. And that's sort of one of the advantages of the startup is, I think, everybody in your company probably feels that they could talk to you about a problem, a solution, and could fit that scenario where they've given it some thought.
I think that's right. I think that the follow-on for that is, regardless of whether it's the CEO's office or it's your manager or whoever it is, I think always just think about the fact that your job is to help your manager do a better job. So, if you've got something that you think will help that, if you frame it in a way that, the person across from you realizes that this could help them, you're going to get their attention. If you frame it as a general problem for you or whatever it is, but, if you're framing it as, hey, my VP of sales or director of sales or director of engineering, here's something I think we can do better, and here's, at the end of the day, you're both going to share in sort of the outcome.
Yeah, that's great advice. So I'm wondering for you, Frederick, where you've, like I said, you're building a successful company, you're already the CEO, you're building a great place to work. So I'm curious, what do you wish you'd known earlier in your own career? Are there any lessons learned you'd like to share?
I think fundamentally, the thing that I wish I had sort of embraced a little bit earlier is that there are no 100% right answers. That you have at any given time, if you're trying to make decisions, unless they're really easy decisions, but, most of the times when they come to you, they're not. You have a series of options in front of you, and you can sort of do one or two things. You can either choose now and choose the one that has the highest probability of succeeding, or you have the option to invest in some path that gives you some more information. But you're never going to pick at 100%. If you get really close to 100%, you really should look back and be like, well, what did it cost me to get all of the certainty on this decision? And was that actually really the best path forward for us in the company? Because usually these decisions, if you wait with them, there's a certain benefit to the company that you're holding on. So the sort of the best analogy that I can give for this is, interviewing, filling a job. Once you've established that you need a certain role, you could theoretically pick names out of a hat, but based just on names, knowing nothing else about the candidates. It's pretty clear that approach to filling a job vacancy has very low likelihood of succeeding. And whatever name you pick out of the hat is almost, has a 0% likelihood or an equivalent likelihood on all of the other choices. So what do people do? Well, they get a resume. And then after that, you have a little bit more likelihood. You have a front runner. But usually people don't stop at that. They take yet another step, and they say, all right, we'll bring somebody in for a first round interview. So now you spend 4 to 5 hours with people, and maybe you wait for 2 to 3 weeks before making a choice. And then often people say, hey, I still want a little more certainty. So I'm going to bring the top 2 candidates in for a broader second round. And again, you wait with the impact of the business for 3 to 4 weeks. But you're investing 3 to 4 hours of your own time. And then at that point, many times people say, okay, now we know enough. But you could, and I've certainly made this mistake before, continue that interview process for, almost forever because you're afraid of making the wrong choice. You're scared of saying, well, I'm not sure. There's still a 10% likelihood that I might be wrong in this area. And so you're really optimizing for something different than the right choice for the company. You're optimizing for basically not being wrong. And if you factor in the time for change and how much you're delaying the impact of the business, that almost always ends up being the wrong approach. So embracing that uncertainty, embracing the fact that the higher you go in terms of position or role, the more uncertainty, that really becomes your job. is to maximize a certain area rather than sort of execute a given task. And fundamentally, business is not science. There's too many factors. That you can go from one industry, from one company to the other, and the customers could be different, geography could be different, your partners could be different. So what worked in one substance, very much doesn't necessarily work in the other one. And if you can embrace that and say, hey, look, it's about trying to pick the best option at any given time, and not necessarily to feel like I'm right. I mean, several times, right? The right option for us is to go with a decision which we don't have more than 30% likelihood is the right one. But we need to go up forth, and then again, we can do the same thing we talked about otherwise. You can learn from it, right? No decision is ever final. So you can always reverse that decision. But waiting and sort of trying to optimize and being afraid of being wrong in that instance, I think that can end up hurting the business and yourself in terms of time and everything else.
Yeah, I think that is such great advice, Frederick. And it's so funny because you're reminding me of early out of college. And so, you're mentioning, really embrace the uncertainty, and what you really need to learn to trust your intuition at some point and know that, when you trust your gut instincts, I know this is the right decision because there's this opportunity cost. But I'll never forget, you just reminded me of I'm going to say I was pretty early out of college. I just was a computer programmer. I was talking to our senior executive at the time. And I really was struggling with some decision on a project. And I remember him puffing at my boss. He was puffing on his pipe. And he said, Donna, you have to learn to deal with the gray areas. Mm-hmm. And it's never going to be black and white. You got to learn to deal. And he always would say that you got to learn to deal with the gray areas. Because being in technology at a young age, I was always looking for that really clear cut, on or off, highly structured, logical analysis with a clear conclusion, right? And it was good advice early on, but anyway, so I love what you're saying because there's that opportunity cost of waiting.
Yep, no, it's very, the thing is, it's very real, but it's hard to see. No one reminds you while you're waiting for a decision. There's no one who comes up to you and sort of says, hey, by the way, the opportunity cost has now risen to X or Y. But you have to be cognizant that it's probably always there.
So many great words of wisdom, Frederick. I just, I want to thank you. But before we wrap up, I just want to ask you, if somebody listening would like to find out more or they'd like to connect with you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Probably LinkedIn. So I'm Frederik Rasmussen, all in one word, on LinkedIn. So you can find me there, currently employed by innRoad.
Fantastic. And before we wrap up and say goodbye, I just want to mention that for anybody listening, I'd love to ask you if you found this interview to be helpful. I'd love to get your feedback. You can just simply go into iTunes, click on the Success Talk Show, click on the tab for ratings and reviews, and provide a comment. It would be fantastic. Because I think, Frederick, from my point of view, I think you've shared so much great advice. So hopefully our listeners are getting some really great value from your wisdom and your experience on your path. So thank you, Frederick. Thank you for your time today.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.